If what he's suggesting is that the debt ceiling itself is fraud, because after a bunch of procedural wrangling, they avoid it, then I would agree with him. My suspicion is that a debt ceiling is inconvenient for him. He figures it's his turn to prioritize his spending as opposed to Democratic spending. At the risk of offending people around the holiday season, I'm bipartisan. I don't like Republican spending, and I don't like Democratic spending. I do feel if what he's saying is that the debt ceiling is artificial and fraudulent, I agree with that. I happen to think it's necessary, but I've observed for my entire adult life them finding procedural ways around the debt ceiling. So there isn't one, despite the fact that it's law. A bigger issue, I think, that Americans pay no attention to. Most of the government debt isn't on balance sheet. The debt ceiling involves $36 trillion owed to bondholders. The Congressional Budget Office says that the net present value of unfunded government liabilities, that's entitlements, exceeds $100 trillion. That $100 trillion, they acknowledge its existence, isn't even discussed in the debt ceiling because it's fraud. Up till now, entitlements have been the third rail of American politics. Touch it and you will die. Vote for it today and you will be out of office before the bill comes due. But the bill is coming due. The bill is truly coming through. I honestly do my best every day, as I think you note on social media, at trying to call people's attention to $100 trillion in off-balance sheet liabilities and the impossibility that fairly naive voters who believe that they will receive these benefits will actually receive them. I actually think that those of us who are numerate are committing fraud by causing people to believe that benefits will be there for them when they will not. I'm an optimist about the American economy. Despite our government and despite our differences as people, we still have a culture where 5 or 6 kids can take over a garage in Sunnyvale, California, and out pops Google. I mean, we're astonishing in that our individual creativity, our individual tenacity can fund our collective stupidity. It's just that our collective stupidity is beginning to win. The arithmetic around our collective debts is too high. I think I know the way out of it, and it's truly ugly. We'll fiddle around the edges. In Social Security, as an example, we will raise the eligibility year. It'll be a fight, but it'll happen. We will also remove the cap on contributions so that old, fat, rich guys like me, rather than having their income cap at $160,000, will have it unlimited. At the same time that we means test the benefit, which means that the theft from people like me will become overt as opposed to covert. But none of that's enough. What we will ultimately do is solve the problem, if that's the right phrase, by devaluing the US dollar enough that the net present value of the obligation is removed. That is to say, some old codger who has been promised $4,000 a month by Social Security will continue to get it, but the $4,000 will buy what $600 or $700 used to do. We faced this in the 1970s. The marginal tax rate was at 70%, but government debt, government obligations were still unserviceable. According to the U.S. government's calculation, the spending power of the U.S. dollar declined by 75% in 10 years. We honored the nominal value of our obligations by inflating away the net present value of those obligations. And in this circumstance, past is prologue. The IRS suggests that the private net worth of Americans, not the government's money, is about $141 trillion. Big sum of money, right? On-balance sheet liabilities are $36 trillion. Off-balance sheet liabilities are $100 trillion. That's $136 trillion out of $141 trillion. Now, that's not if you increase taxes on the billionaires. That's if you stole all of everyone's wealth. They say, if we just tax the billionaires, the problem goes away. Aggregate net worth of the billionaires, according to the IRS, is $5.6 trillion. If you stole all of their money, you would operate the U.S. government for 15 months, and you wouldn't deal with the debt. The way you get out of this is somehow devaluing the benefits while at the same time allow the economy to grow. I mean, make no mistake, we'll get through this just the way we got through it in the 70s. It will be ugly, and there will be winners, and there will be losers. You know, I'm not one of these people who say that the U.S. is going to implode, that the U.S. dollar is going to zero, the U.S. Treasury market is going the way of a dodo. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's going to be losers, and we need to begin to discuss getting through this now. I would encourage people who are encouraged themselves by the concept of the Department of Government Efficiency to consider two things. Mr. Musk partly became a billionaire out of subsidies. That's the first thing. The second thing is a little uglier and a little more pernicious. Read a book called The Triumph of Politics by our mutual friend David Stockman. He was the director of the Office of Management and Budget under Reagan. Reagan actually had a popular mandate to reduce the size of government than President-elect Trump has. And in the book, David Stockman details how the political process, how the interest groups, including Republican interest groups, derailed the Reagan Revolution in 120 days. Now, I'm encouraged that David Stockman is encouraged because he literally wrote the book on how the swamp fights back being drained. When people ask me online, when's gold finally going to move? I say, the year 2000. It was at $253. Now it's at $2,700. I mean, compared to what? Now, I think it's going to move more dramatically in the years ahead if you pay attention to $100 trillion in off-balance sheet obligations, that you come to the conclusion that the only way out of that trap is reducing the spending power of the U.S. dollar. If you do that, like in the 1970s, when you reduce the purchasing power of the medium of exchange by 75%, the other thing that happened in the 1970s is that the price of gold went from an admittedly price-controlled $35 to $850. I'm not saying that past is prologue. What I am saying is that people who perceive the problem might consider insuring themselves with the store of value that worked last time. I think the narrative will be slow for people to adopt because gold hasn't been front and center in the popular imagination since the early part of the decade of the 1980s. I'm old enough to remember the fact that gold wasn't particularly popular at the beginning of the decade of the 1970s, but it was really popular on the way out. And I think if you and I are having a discussion, which I hope we will have in 10 years, that we are able to sort of laughingly track the ascent of gold, and the fact that those people who listened to what we had to say and made up their own decision got through the next 10 years with less discomfort than they otherwise would have. I suspect that his embrace of crypto was partly transactional. Elections are everywhere and always advanced auctions of stolen property, whether your team wins or not. And I suspect that Mr. Trump's embracement of Bitcoin in particular, and crypto in general, had a lot to do with embracing nakedly campaign contributions, but also embracing a constituency that he thought was fervent enough that they would vote for him based on that one topic. Bitcoin has performed better than gold. People who have no idea of the value of either are attracted to the momentum of one. So it makes absolute sense that he could get traction. I personally, because I'm anti-government, would love to see the U.S. government sell its gold. I'd like to buy some. I think it would be a tragedy if the gold price went up tenfold and the government benefited. I would rather that gold be held by private individuals rather than the government. I realize that mine is a very, very unpopular point of view, not shared by people who believe that their government is of and by them. I don't happen to be one of those. And ultimately, the asset class that the government chooses for its reserve is probably not up to me. For that matter, I don't think they know very much about government or the constituents of government reserves. And in that case, they look at an asset class that has performed extremely well relative to an asset class that's only done its job, and they're attracted to the narrative around the asset class that's done well. One of the things I've noticed as an investor is I will plead with people. I mean, I'll do everything except for call their damn broker, and sometimes I will call their broker to cause them to buy assets that are out of favor, like uranium was at $20 when the price had to go up. And after it's gone from 20 to 100, which is to say after the price move has already taken the value out of the narrative, they adopt the narrative. Now, I'm not saying that Bitcoin at $100,000 has priced itself away from its narrative. Mm-hmm. All I'm trying to say is that when Bitcoin was probably relatively cheap compared to the network effect at, say, $1,000, it was an exotic instrument. Nobody wanted it. Now that it's up 100-fold, everybody wants it. The idea that it would be popular after its price caused its utility relative to price to degrade, it makes absolute sense that most of the voters would want it as one of the national assets. H.L. Mencken, I think it was, said, the voters usually get what they want, often good and hard. And I think that's a message that people need to absorb.